just select out the repo that we are going to be using today in the lesson that's going to build on what we've been working on already. As you can see, this is called mongoose relationships. And like usual, what you're going to want to do is fork and clone it. And once you do that, you're going to want to do that in your trainings folder. I'll go ahead and start sharing the screen. Okay, so mongoose relationships. The prerequisites are obviously MongoDB, which you started on Saturday, the mongoose study, which we had for homework, and the mongoose lesson, which we just wrapped up. As I told to one of the groups, we're going to be doing a lot more similar reps, this time with relationship docs, which we'll see come in two different ways, subdocuments and references. So by the end of this talk, we will be able to add nested schema and use subdocuments in Mongoose. And we will also be able to add references and use the populate method, which is something that's really interesting and unique to Mongoose. And so those are the two approaches that we get for relationships, which are documents that are connected to other documents. If we remember, everything in Mongoose is stored in a document, which is basically a specific JSON type object, right? In Mongo, it's actually Bison or binary JSON. So the first thing that we're going to see here is we have this subheading of subdocuments, and we have a link to the subdocuments reference in the Mongoose docs. And this is a quote directly from the docs. And so it says, subdocuments are documents that are embedded in other documents. In Mongoose, this means that you can nest schemas inside of another schema. Mongoose has two distinct notions of subdocuments: arrays of subdocuments and a single nested subdocument. So this image is also from the docs. And we can see that this is something like a user document. And we can tell because there's one field here, that's the username. And then we have two different types of, or we have two embedded subdocuments here, right? And so these are this, the notion of a single nested subdocument. And we have contact here, which has its own document that has two fields, phone and email, and then we also have an access embedded subdocument. And so what we could have instead of this, where everything is, what we could do to get something like this is we can look at this example here. And so here we have a reference to a contact schema. So the contact schema has a phone field, which is type string, an email, which is also type string. We also have a post schema, which is has a title, which is a string, and a body, which is a string. And we also have a user schema. And so these are the two different ways that we can have embedded documents. This is the single embedded document. And here for posts, we have an array of subdocuments. So when have a single nested contact subdocument, that's only because a user is only going to have one form of contact, right? And when we have something like posts, a user on an application that would use like a model like this, a user usually can make many posts, right? So having a single embedded document wouldn't make sense here. And what's really cool about Mongoose is that it allows for us to put a reference to a schema here in array bracket notation. And that means that we can push and remove particular posts, similar to the ways that we would use regular JavaScript methods. Okay, let me check out the question thread. Do we have a question thread going already? Okay. I'm just going to interrupt this so I get. Okay. So in the example above, we added two different kinds of relationships. One is a one-to-one relationship, and the other is a one-to-many. So we have some diagrams here, and these are pretty useful. And you'll see between here, which is the one-to-one and one-to-many, we'll see this structuring in, especially within SQL, in what we call entity relationship diagrams. We don't really need to do those within NoSQL architecture within Mongo, but it's still helpful to use this kind of diagramming to kind of make sense of things. So with the one-to-one relationship, a user schema, which we're looking at here, right? The user schema has a one-to-one relationship with our contact. And that's because, as I said earlier, each user has one contact. Conversely, it also means that each contact only has one user. And so when we're looking at one-to-one in the entity relationship diagrams, that'll be represented by a single line or like a little cross coming from each of the two entities, right? And that was where we defined contact, and we have it as a single embedded object. The next one that we looked at in the example was the user schema, which has a one-to-many relationship with posts. And that's because each user can have many posts. And while each user, each post only has one user. So when we see within this entity relationship, we have a user where there's only one user, and we have many. And that's this, the connection symbol here. It kind of looks like a, stick figure drawing of like a bird foot, like a chicken foot. And so these are the two first different types of references that we're going to be working on today. We're going to first be doing that in a code along. But I'll wait to see, does anyone have any questions so far on this? Either the single embedding in general, and perhaps some of it's going to become a little bit more clear as we get into the example, building on the last slide. This repo pretty much picks up where we left off of. Okay, cool. So code along. Yes, Deepa.
I'm trying to think of a realistic example. For example, one-to-many would be one user uploading a lot of photos in Google Photos or something would be something ideal for this. Like,
yeah, or I would even, I think a blog format or any kind of social media app where a user is going to have many posts would be very useful. We're going to be looking at an example with comments. So comments is a very common one where something like a post would have many comments. So does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool. No, of course. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a code along where we're going to actually do exactly what I was just talking about with DEPA, which is we're going to have a one-to-many relationship of comments to places, right? And we just finished up places in the last lab. And so together, we're going to create our first one-to-many relationship. And for this relationship, we're going to say one place has many comments. And so we're going to be going through three of our three CRUD steps. So we're going to be first creating a comment for a place. Then we're going to read all comments for a place by reading a place. And then we're going to read a comment, a specific comment for a place. And so what we can do is after you've npm-die and or cd'd into the repo that you've cloned down and npm-i, we can open this in VS Code. Okay. And so let's reference the docs. So what's really good about the subdocuments or the docs in general among Mongoose is that they have some pretty interesting examples. So I'm going to throw this up over on the left half. Do people want me to make this a little bit bigger? Is this readable? Maybe make it just a little bit bigger. Okay. And so in the subdoc or in the subdocs, or the documents for Mongoose in the subdocuments, they're going to show us an example, right? And their example that they use is a subdocument called the child schema. And you can see that where they're defining a new schema. And all it has is one field, just a name that's type string. And the child schema is going to go inside of a parent schema, right? And we can see there's the two different ways, right? There's the array method, which would allow the parent to have many children, or it could be a single nested subdocument, which would be just one child with one reference to the child schema. So what's really good is they have all of these breakdowns here. And these are really good for going through a lot of different things, including some of our CRUD actions, because as we'll see, they're a little bit different than just the normal way that we would do CRUD. It gets a little bit more specific because we're going to have multiple reference IDs that we're going to need to hit because we're not just referencing the outermost document, but we might be referencing something inside of that. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to check out our models, right? And so we can see last time we defined we have our models and they're already built here for person and place. And so the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to create a schema, not a model, for comment. And so we can do that by first creating a file. Spelling comment, right? Okay, yeah. Called comment.js. And just to show you, we can also do that by going into terminal and doing touch models. Touches. Okay. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is this. And so the first thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to require mongoose, because we're going to be using the mongoose. We're going to be using that dependency in order to extract things like the schema in order to create new schemas. And so we do that first by doing const mongoose equals require mongoose. And then the next thing that we're going to want to do to save us some time in typing is we're going to want to create either what we call the schema constructor, or we're extracting the schema out of the mongoose library. And so we can do that by doing const schema equals mongoose refers to up here, and we want to just pull out the schema from it. And you can see that it has a bunch of these different types of constructors. We just want the schema one. And so we can add a comment here that this is creating the schema constructor. A little bit easier for us. Okay. And so the first thing that we're going to want to do, or the next thing that we're going to want to do, is we want to actually create the common schema. So what we're going to do is we're going to call it common schema. This is just convention. And we want to reference this constructor that we just created on line 7. And we can open an object here. And now within this, we're going to want to define the type of fields that we're going to want in a comment. And for a comment, the first thing that we're going to want is a comment needs to have a title. And we're going to give that type string. And the second thing would be a body, right? The actual text that is being written. And that we're also going to want to define type string. And then the next thing that we're going to want to do, because this is very helpful, is after defining what's actually the structure of a schema, the second object that gets passed when we're calling the constructor is our options. And one of the very helpful ones is timestamps. And timestamps allow us to see when the entry was created and also updated. And this can be really useful when we're organizing information on our front end. It's also helpful as you're creating and tweaking your database to make sure that you're actually updating certain documents and not just pushing things and adding new entries. As Mongo and Mongoose are very flexible, and sometimes you'll actually witness this happening when you're not actually hitting the right things. This can be especially frustrating when you're referencing a whole new database, like because you have a spelling error, and Mongo is going to go ahead and create that for you, not recognizing that, oh, there's an error, like you called the wrong name. So all we got to do is set timestamps to be true. Okay. So now that we have our comment schema we have the structure to find out with our options. The last step would be to export it. We do that by saying module.exports equals comment schema. Okay, so when we go and we look at these examples here, or in the docs, right? We can see that these are this nested sub schema or the sub document that we've created for the parent schema. This is like written as if it's all in the same file. And we could, of course, do that, right? We could put comment and we could have all of that defined within place. The problem there being is that this is allows us to be very modular, right? So this means that we can use comments in multiple things. So if we have place defined, we might also define something like a tourist attraction or a movie. And if we want users to be able to comment on that, it's very helpful to define this in one place. And that way we don't have to go and update the subdocument of comment in each of those, right? If we want to keep comments consistent throughout our application. Okay. Any questions so far? Thread looks pretty empty. Okay. So now that we have, yeah. Well,
yeah, I just wanted to clarify. So this mongoose schema, the constructor that we're extracting from there. So ultimately, is mongoose just like ultimately just is it a module or is it an object?
Oh, okay. So it is a module. Though, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, all libraries break down into gigantic objects, right? Or they're extended prototypes.
So I think thinking of it as a library and as a giant object are both great ways to think of it. One reason to think of it as a library is, yeah, it's a library that they're providing. We go ahead and require up at the top like other libraries. In the future, you're going to see us use the Express library. You can also think of it as an object, because if y'all remember back from whenever you were writing your own exports, in one file, you need to say module.exports equals an object. You could technically export like a function. You don't technically have to do an object, but if you want to export multiple things, the object makes the most sense. So that's why we're using that for exports back inside of unit 1. Same kind of idea over here. In their library, they have a module.exports or the equivalent, and they're exporting some giant object for us. So whenever you're going ahead and importing it, that is an object. So you could say mongoose.S schema and like dot onto that object if you wanted to. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Anything else?
And so that's why we're able to use dot notation to extract just this method, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, oh yeah, we're using dot notation. I was like, same thing like objects, I guess. So yeah, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so now that we've got this defined, the next step would be to, we want to add this to our place. And the first thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go to our place model. And what we want to first do is we want to actually import the thing that we just added. Make sure I'm in the right place in my notes. Okay. So we can do that by under our library. I would always import the library first. We want to require the comment schema. And we can do that by doing const comment schema equals require. We're in the same folder, right? What's helpful about VS Code, as I think Weston was showing us 2 lessons ago, is that if we put / it'll show us all the files that are within the folder that we're in. And we want to be going and grabbing so now we'll see our delinter is giving us an error because it's saying, hey, you've required this. We set it to a variable, but we haven't actually used it. And so what we can do is we can go down under country. And because we've defined it elsewhere, all we have to do is that we can add a field called comments, right? Because we know that there's going to be multiple of these. And we can put this reference to the comment schema. So when we import this here, we're importing all of this. And we're referencing that, hey, on our place, we are going to have a property called comments that's going to have comments, the comment as we defined it in our comment schema here inside of it. And so just to show this in action a little, if we go up to our bin and go to place, and we go to create, and we run our create, we'll see that we have the Boston object, and it doesn't have comments, right? But if we go ahead and we add that back in, use our show method. Oh.
You had a slash in the front, that's why.
Thank you. Okay, and so now we can see that as we defined in our schema, that's how everything's going to be referenced back, right? So now we know that there's a field called comments, and it's empty, right? Because we haven't added any comments in here, so it's just an empty array. Yep.
Oh, my bad. So for this one, you see how you added it in the places.js in the models?
Mm-hmm.
So this doesn't follow like the regular syntax of like how we had the other stuff, like kind of just creating a, oh, actually, never mind. Okay, cool. Thank you. I see it right here. I thought you had to wrap it in an object, but we're not doing that. It's my bad. It's in square brackets. Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was your?
No, I was just a little bit confused about, yeah, right there, but it's
Oh,
in
yeah,
square
we're
brackets.
using square
Yeah,
brackets. Yeah,
Thank
because it's an array. It's going to be an array of comments, right? and we don't have to say that because this is where we're defining our schemas, we're not going to actually say which comments are in here. We're just referencing that this is all of the things that we're going to add to this array are going to follow the format of the comment schema, which means that each will be an object that has two fields, a title, which is a type string, and a body, right? So the title of the comment and the body, or the content of the comment.
That's like where the one-to-many comes into, right? Because it's like you're
Right.
getting an array. If it was an
Right,
object,
so
it'd
we
be the
have-
one-to-one.
Yeah, if we look back here, right, this is one-to-many. So we have here, you can imagine we have our place, and then the many would be our comments, right? So each place can have many comments.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that helps a lot.
Oh, no problem. Alex?
What was the code that you ran, or the command that you ran in the terminal to get the ID?
So what I did
It's
was
like
I went to the place bin, and I went to the create, and I ran this line of code on line 18, which is just the create method for adding a place for Boston. And when I ran that, what we'll see is that down here, we create the object, right? And then with our dots then statement, we log it, right? If there's not an error. And so that's what's happening right here, right? So all I did was I created, and then I ran show, which is another command, which will just show it. But when I created it up here, using this command right here, right? Which is the same as the one on line 18 here. Right? This will return the object. And so when I was running the show command, I just grabbed the ID, just copied and pasted it from the return object. Does that make sense?
You kind of. I tried to do the line,
So
run that same line, but
yeah, so
I got an
show-
error.
the comment would be, or to get the show command, that's on line 18 of place show.js, or bin place show.js, line 18. And right here, it has just a fake reference ID.
Wait, so that's in create.js?
That's in show.js.
Okay.
That's the second one I ran to show you that, because I didn't want to create a new one, right? I just wanted to look at this one and show that when I uncommented out, here, when I uncommented out line 33, I just close these so it's a little bit, see what you see. When I commented out line 33, and we created the object, we got something like this, right? And it didn't have the comments field. When I commented back in and I use show, the show command with this object ID for the Boston object, it's giving it the object back, but now we can see that comments is one of the fields on this schema, right? So it's going to show back up in the return object.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Deepa?
Yeah, could we have, I'm trying to understand. So can we have nested inside the comments? We have an array, right? Could we have another nested array inside that?
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, I'm just asking.
So like, okay.
Here's an example. I can, I'm just thinking in terms of an example. For example, if you're reviewing a product, right? You can add stars and you can also comment. Sometimes you just don't comment, you just add stars, right? So can that be mimicked here? That's my question. So you will have a review, and inside that object, you would have both stars, which would be an array of either 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then you would also have a comment inside that, something like that.
Okay, well, okay, I'm gonna code out like a quick example here where I think it would make a little bit more sense without jumping to what we're gonna learn about later on with references. When we get to references, I can loop back to this and kind of show an example that's like makes way more sense in the real world, right? But like what we could have is something like, like a comment review equals a new schema, right? And that could have a user, which is string, review, which is a number. It could also be something like an enumeration, which is, so like 1 through 5 could be like, hate it to great or something like that, right? And yeah, and then these could go into another array here, which takes in the schema of comment review. Now, here's the thing about this, where this kind of gets pretty wild, is that when we create comments, as we'll see in a second, each one of these is going to have its own unique Mongo object ID, right? That's the cool thing about Mongo and Mongoose. Now, the problem is that if we want to reference particular reviews and hit them and update them or delete them, we're going to need the object ID for the place, and then the object ID for the comment, and then the object ID for the comment review. And so here's where we get into kind of like CRUD ID hell. And we're going to try to avoid that, right? So you kind of want to make it, I think it's pretty much convention that you'd want to figure out how to define this logic, maybe within the comment. With things like references, it can become much easier. And yeah, so you probably won't see this. So I'm going to remove this just so when I push this code up, and I've been on the main, which is no good. So I won't be pushing the code up. I will just be copying it and then switching over to a different branch. But here, I will go ahead and make sure that I'm going to put these in the code channel now so everybody has them.
So in that case, you see in YouTube, you can add a comment and then somebody can reply it. So there's a chain of things that goes on in there, right? So I'm not so sure as how do you get those. I'm pretty sure it's not one to, it's one to many, but then there it gets a little complicated over that area too. I'm still not able to map it out in my head.
Yes, so there, and I'm not sure what kind of architecture they're using for the comments on YouTube, but I imagine that it's nested object. It's 2 layers down, similar to what you were talking about. But they're going to be using like very robust queries and CRUD operations. So, it's not going to be such a nightmare when you're working with such a big and widely used product that is expecting that many users, right? And let me add this one. So this is the update to models. Place. Okay, so anyone gets confused, or if we really only added one line here, or two, we required the comment schema and then added it as an embedded reference array. Okay. Looks like we don't have any more questions. So now we can start to look at what we can do to create a comment. And so what we're going to want to do is similar to how we were doing that with person and place. Let's look at this right now. We'll use this as a reference. We're going to want within our bin to create a new folder, a new directory, right? So we can do that from here. So you can do that using this, or of course you can use the GUI in VS Code. And so within our comment folder, we're going to want to create a file called create.js. Of course, we can put these pretty much anywhere, but it's helpful since we've already had a defined structure that we're going to be wanting to be doing that, similar to how we defined an organizer file for place and person. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is we need to require Mongoose. Or we can instantiate it, right? That's another term that we can use. So instantiate or require. Do that as const mongoose equals require mongoose. Okay, can anyone guess what the next step is? So I have it right here, right? We have the create from our place. And so the next step that we're going to want to do is we need to connect connecting Mongoose to MongoDB, right? So we can do that. Is mongoose.connect. I just copied and paste Mongo address because I knew I was going to spell something wrong. And we're going to have these two Mongo settings, which make the way that everything is structured much easier. And then, of course, we want to connect to the DB. Okay. So we're going to have to acquire the place model. We'll do that using const place, place require. And so similarly to how we were able to create a place using our inputs from the command line, we're going to want to do that here. Just going to add this here because this is going to be the structure that we're going to want to have our command. So we're going to want to have node, which is our first argument always. Then we're going to want to reference the file, which is this create.js file within the bin comment folder. And then the first argument that we're going to want is the place ID, and that's a user input. Then we're going to want the comment title, right? Because if we go back and we look at our comment model, the model has a title and a body. And then so the second thing that we're going to want is the comment body. That's also user input. And so we need to define these out. So to get input from the command line, we define our argvs, right? So we can look, and we can look at what the first one is. So const place ID user input is equal to process.argv. And we're going to want to have this at index 2. So as I said earlier, the first two arguments, so at the 0 and 1 index, are going to be the node command, which actually references the node file. This is an alias. So our CLI knows that we mean reference the, again, actually pull up node itself, and then the file that we're wanting to reference, which is this here. So the next one will be the comment title user input. That will be the third. Because I'm lazy, I'm just going to duplicate those. So we have our place ID user input, we have our comment title user input, and the comment body user input. Those are going to be the 3 extra arguments for when we run this command. And we can have something like node bin comment create.js. And then for this first one, we're going to want to have object ID from place. And we want the comment title. And the final argument being the comment body. And that will be something like love this city. So many historical places to visit. And these are specific comments to Boston. And we're going to add those in a bit when we finish out this. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is we need to actually open our DB connection and find the document that we want to place. And then we're going to want to actually add the comment in. So we want to open the connection to the database. And we can okay. So what's useful about this is this next part is going to pretty much follow the same structure that we used for our show method for place. And that's because we're really finding a place by ID, and then we're going to do some extra functionality onto it. So rather than write this all out again, we can go ahead and copy everything from line 22 to 33 from our show.js in the place folder within our bin. Any questions with what we've done so far? Anything in the question thread that we should address? Looks like, Sammy, you were asking about the difference between MongoDB and Mongoose. So MongoDB is, yeah, as Ben said, is the database. It's a NoSQL database. It's created by a privately held company, as opposed to something like SQL, which is can be open source or not. And Mongoose is a library that makes it easier to interact with Mongo, to use JavaScript methods in order to actually make and create things. So rather than using raw Mongo, which is actually the documents are kind of poor for it, and some of the methodology is very confusing. And that's because they want you to pay for their services. They have Mongo experts that can come into your company. So they have a financial incentive there. Where Mongoose is what we call an ODM, or an object document mapper. In SQL, we have these things called ORMs. So an analogy for Mongoose to something that we use in SQL would be something like SQLize. That's a JavaScript library for interacting with SQL through JavaScript. And yeah, what Mongoose allows us to do is like not only make sure that we're writing particular CRUD methodologies, but also defining our schemas. Because otherwise, Mongo doesn't really have that, right? It doesn't care. If you push documents, it'll do whatever you want. Whatever you tell it to put into whatever object you pass in, it's going to create that document. And there's no structure. So the Mongoose as a library, as an ODN, allows us to have that structure and keep it consistent whenever we're either accessing our documents or doing other CRUD operations on them. So Wally, yeah, I see you have a question.
Yes. So since we're using .then and .catch, I wanted to ask this earlier, but I completely forgot about it.
Yeah.
This is a promise, right? We're technically, or no?
Kind of. So it uses the promise structure, but technically they are not necessarily promises. Ben, you might be better able to speak on this.
Look at the docs, and this is something we mentioned on Saturday, so you can also look back at probably the end of that lesson. I think it was actually like the last 30 minutes of the lessons where that would come up. But the idea is some of the methods inside of Mongoose aren't going to return a promise. Instead, they're going to return something called a query object. Now, a query object really looks like a promise. It's got a .then on it. It's got a .catch on it. I think they called it thenable because you can .then or .catch on it. But it's not going to have a .finally on it. Now, the weird thing is we can still call .finally at the end, and that's because somewhere down this line, one of those .thens that we call, or the .catches, returns a promise. So by the time we get to the end of the chain, it is a promise, but it starts as a query object. Now, this isn't going to come up, going to be super useful or super important to know about, but later inside of this lesson, Sean's going to show you all a method called populate. Now, populate wouldn't exist on a promise, but it does exist on these query objects, which is why they do that. But we can hold that off until Sean shows you populate later.
What was it called one more time? It's called query what?
A query object is what they call in the docs, just QUERY is what they called it.
All right.
If my memory from Saturday is correct, I think it's query.
Okay. So, we've been going for about an hour, so perhaps let's take a 7-minute break and come back at 9 o'clock. I'm going to put that in the forum. And then we can finish up writing this method and actually push some comments. We'll see you back here at 9 o'clock PST. resume the recording first. Okay. So before break, we had just copied over the show method. And we're going to want to modify it a bit. And so if we looked at the show method for place, what we were doing is we were finding it by the place ID, which we got from the user input. And then we get the place as a return object. And we're logging that with the QJSON method. And what we're going to see is that what we're going to want to do is push this information that we're getting from the user into the place comments. And what we can do is we can add a new line here. And so we want to call place dot comments dot push, because Mongoose allows us to use something. It's a different method that's built into Mongoose, but it's pretty much the same method as pushing to an array in JavaScript. And so what we're going to want to push is the title, which comes from comment title user input. And we also want to push the body, which comes from comment body user input. We just added a comment on line 32. That's adding a comment to the place with the push method. And then the next thing that we're going to want to do is we want to save this. Then we're going to want to just have closure here from the stop then. And we're going to want to add another dot then. We have this as a single return. And so what this is going to do for readability, I'm going to hit an enter there. And this will print our updated place, which now has the comment that we added. So that's what's going to happen on line 41. If there's an error, it will hit the dot catch and log the error. And then finally, we're going to close the database connection. Okay. Let's look at the thread. Okay, great. It looks like there aren't any questions, so let's check it out. Copy this. I'm going to duplicate this line and add the ID. I'm going to post this in the code channel just so everybody has the command. Oh, but replace the object ID obviously with your city's object ID. Okay. So that's updated in the code channel. And if I go ahead and copy that. Okay. We can see that we have this return object. And within our comments array, we have the object of the comment that we just added. And because we have timestamps, we can see that it has the two fields of created at, updated at, which does it automatically. We don't have to do anything with that. And it's going to have our title that we entered, which was our the fourth argument, or the third, or the object, or the argument at the third index, and the body, which comes from the fifth argument, or the argument with index 4. Okay, so if this is not working for you, please post up in the thread. And do make sure to copy or screenshot your whole error, as that's going to be helpful for us debugging. Okay, so we have gone ahead and we can check off this first one. We have created a comment for a place. Okay, so now we want to look at, we want to read all the comments for a place by reading a place. And what's nice about this is that we pretty much have a method for this already done. And that would be that we can just use our show method. In place, and that's going to give us all the comments, right? And so if I were to go back in and add a second comment, oops. So this is negative review of Boston. Now we have 2 comments. And if I run show again, I will see that the show method is going to already call all the comments, right? And so that's pretty useful because by reading for a place, we're going to get pretty much the index method for comments. So we don't need to go ahead and do that. It's already done for us. We've already written that in our code. But what about if we wanted to just read a single comment? So read a particular comment, right? Not all of the comments for a place. So because we are going to be using pretty much most of the code, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to grab all the code from create, and within our comment folder, within our bin, I'm going to want to touch a new folder or a new file called show.js. And in this file, we're going to define how to find a single comment. Okay, so the first place is that, or the first place that we're going to diverge from our create method. Ooh, yeah, Alex, I see you have a question.
I was going to ask if you could Slack out the create.js in the messenger.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. So wait, did I just copy and paste the right one? Yes. Okay. So when we get to here, where we're going to need to get input from the command line, we need to define our args. What's going to be different about this when we're reading, when we're just trying to read a single comment, is that we're only going to have 2 arguments that we're actually having from the user, right? So the first is going to be the same, right? We're going to want to have const that's the place ID of the user input, because we need to first find the place. The second one we're going to want is the comment ID. And we don't actually have to have a title or a body because we're just trying to read from here. We know that if we have the ID for the particular comment, we can access that comment and show the title and body. Okay, so similarly, we want to open a connection to the database so we can do our CRUD. Here, we're doing R. We're reading the comment. So we first do place find by ID, and that's going to be our first argument, which is the user ID. Give me 1 second. I should have, sorry, doing okay. So we can now do and you can also reference in the subdocs. There's a method for finding the subdocument. And so each subdocument has its own ID by default. And the Mongoose document arrays have a special ID method for searching a document array to find a document with a given ID. And so we can look at that here, right? And so similarly, what we're going to want to do is have const comment equals to place, because we've already returned the place by using the user ID input for the place ID. And so that's the return object that we're passing in the promise. Place.comments.id. Here we want to use comment ID user info. Here we are using the method that's built in to find the subdocument. Its ID. And what we're going to have to do is return the comment, right? So there's actually this comment where we can log it then, right? Alternatively, another method to do, alternatively, a shorter method would be something like this, right? Rather than already assigning, or rather than assigning this to a variable and returning the variable, we can just return this. Okay, so either you can use the built-in method like they do within the docs, assign it to a variable, right? In the docs, they're using very generic language, right? So they're saying const doc equals the parent. In our case, the parent is place with the child. And that's because they were using the parent and children. For children, that would be our comment. And this method. and return that variable, right? Or instead, if we commented this out, we could run something like this, where we're just returning everything that we set equal to the variable. They do the exact same thing. So just because it's referencing to the docs, I'm going to use the same kind of syntax that they use. Okay. Cool. All right. And then oh. Then we don't have to save the place. So we haven't actually done anything to it. We can get rid of this as well. And we have our dot catch and our close. Let's check this out. So it's going to be node . And then we're going to want to do bin comment show.js. So I can actually see my screen. And then we're going to want to have first object ID for place. Finally, object ID for our comment. So you can check this out. If I go into my terminal and I type node bin comment show.js, first I'm going to grab this. That's my first argument. That's the ID for the Boston document. And then I'm going to grab this comment, this first comment, a positive comment. That ID, and I hit enter. We'll see that all we're getting back is a single comment object. Right? If I go up here and I check out this negative comment, I grab that ID. We can also return that.
Can you make your terminal a little bigger, like expand it a little bit more?
Oh yeah, of course.
I don't mean size, I mean like up and down, like horizontally. Like the history of it.
Yeah.
Next.
Like this, you mean, right?
Yeah, thank you.
So here we're calling for this first comment. We get it back here. In this line here, we're calling for the second comment. And we're getting that back here. Okay. You still need this out, Kevin?
Oh, I'm good. Can you slack out your show.js to the?
Of course. Yep. Great. So in code. That's the show.js for comment. Okay. So if we go back to the repo, we have now done the 3 CRUD operations, even though 1 was already done pretty much for us, that we needed to do in this code log. Ollie?
Yeah, I just wanted to like kind of walk back at this, well, walk through it real quick. So we're getting the IDs, the first parameter, that's helping us find the first place, and then the second parameter is going to just help us kind of find we're going to pass in that second parameter, which is the ID for the comments, and we're going to locate the comments like that, right?
Right. Because when we actually do, when we just show a particular place, right? This is the command for show, which is pretty much like indexing all comments, right? When we're just showing a place, we just have to call the ID of the place, right? So ID right here for Boston. To access a single comment, we're going to have to we had to write this show method that uses the same kind of logic within show, where the first argument is the place ID. And then we're using this built-in method that we got from the Mongo docs for finding a subdocument, which is telling us that each of the subdocuments has an ID. We know that, right? Because when we look at the terminal, we see that each of these 2 comments, they each have an ID, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what's cool, you can tell if we look at the hashes that are these IDs, we can kind of start to see that they're kind of in similar places, sort of in the database. So we can recognize that because all these documents are starting with some kind of similar start to the reference ID. So we know that the database probably is referring to them somewhere similarly, but different enough in the hash that they're unique, right?
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Does that answer what you were trying to get at?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Because like later on, when we're making other objects, if we're doing something else, we can kind of follow that same tree, and like whatever the attribute of this one in this place is comments, we could do something else. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Alex?
Yeah, I'm just kind of wondering, like, what would be like a real world example on a job or something where we would use this? Like, would it be like annotating or commenting an existing database?
So while we're running these as node commands, in the real world, we would be defining this kind of logic within a server. And after we finish this lesson, the next couple of lessons that we're going to be having is working with a server architecture or kind of like a library for writing servers in Node called Express. And what we're going to be doing is similarly to, if you remember back to the first project, we were doing CRUD, right? And if you remember back to the objects you were getting back, the game object and the user, that was referencing and hitting a server that was already built for you with a Mongo database that was also already built. And we were doing different types of requests using HTTP requests. And so usually in the real world, there's a front end, something that users actually interact with, right? And I'll go back to something like a social media site where you can make a post as a user, right? And so that's going to be a create method for posts. And then other users can come and comment on that post. And that'll be a create method for something like comments. And so that would be, the analogy would be like what we're doing here for places would be posts, and comments are pretty much the same thing, right? They're just comments on a place versus a post. So this is a very common thing that a lot of different web apps are going to need. Anytime that there's a user trying to get data, anytime there's a user trying to update data, create a new entry of something, we're going to be needing to use this kind of functionality, but it's going to be nested within HTTP requests as opposed to just us running these things in Node.
Okay, so it's like a back-end function.
Yeah. So we're defining it here just so you can get an idea of how this actually works in Mongoose and how the relationships are defined. And later on, we're going to extract that out into actual functional applications that we can hit with a query tool like Postman or Insomnia, or actually building out something, right? Like we could do it with curl requests, like we learned when we were first doing our CRUD operations before we kind of wrote the backend logic. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. So we have about 10 minutes. So I guess what I'm going to, at least we'll start with, and I don't know that we're actually going to break into groups, but I can at least intro the lab. And this is what we will start with on Wednesday's class. And so now that you've seen the kind of like I do, we do of the code along, we're going to have a lab on one-to-many relations of finishing out the CRUD method, right? So we've done the C, the create, we've done reading with our show JS file. And now what you're going to do is do an update and delete. And this will be built on top of what we've done for reading a comment for a place. And the reason why it's going to build upon the reading for the show method that we wrote in our comment is because we're going to want to get not only to the place, right, but we want to get to a specific comment, right? So it's going to build upon these. So when you break into your groups and you're starting the two parts of this lab, remember, I would first go through the lab for update. And then when you've got it all done, you've got all your functionality written out, then of course test it. And as long as that's working, then you can go on to destroy or delete. And what's really nice is that what we have linked here is we have links directly to the docs. And so if we want to look at updating a document, we can look at updating using save, right? And that's going to be the same for updating a subdocument as a normal document. It's going to accept both a new body and title for a specific comment, and these are going to come from the user input. Then you're going to want to find the specific comment you want to update, like and show. And then we want to update the comment's title and body with the new values that we're getting from the user. And we want to make sure that the changes are saved, right? Using the .save method. And you're going to want to obviously return that object and log it if it was successful. And the fourth and final step for that would be to test it. right? So try to actually update one of the comments. And your second thing will be destroying comments, and subdocuments are deleted differently than normal documents. So if we go to the documentation, we can check that out. So it says each subdocument has its own remove method. For an array subdocument, this is equivalent to calling pull on the subdocument. For a single nested comment, remove is equivalent to setting the subdocument to null. And so what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to find the specific comment you want to remove, like in show.js. And then you want to remove this specific comment from the places comments subdocument array. And you want to make sure that it's saved and then go ahead and test it after your group has finished writing out the code. And you'll see that there's a bonus that's pull and remove are both methods that can remove subdocuments. And if you finish early, try removing a comment using the other method. Okay. All right. And that leaves us with 5 minutes left of class. So I will take any more questions that we might have. Stop share here. Okay.